What's going on, fam? This is Kevin the Tech Ninja, and today we're going to talk about the 2022 MacBook Air powered by the M2 chip. And now this was just announced earlier this month, and also announced with it was the M2 chip from Apple. Now with this announcement, Apple brought out the usual graphs and big numbers like 20 billion transistors during its presentations. Although these numbers are important and so are the graphs, for most people it's in one ear and out the other. So let's demystify it a little bit and let me give you my opinion of the M2 MacBook Air, if it's a good purchase. And if you have an M1, is this really an upgrade? The M2 is a faster CPU and a more efficient CPU. Now typically we don't see major chip advancements yearly, but Apple somehow gained a 10% performance boost at the same power level. Now this further widens the gap between the M2 chip and an Intel 10 and 12 core PC. This also widens the gap between the M1 chip, but in a more practical sense. Now, for people who don't use power applications like Final Cut or Photoshop, does this even matter? So I have a M1 MacBook Air right here. I bought this for my wife when it came out. It's an entry-level bare-bone M1 with 8 GB of RAM. Now I did use it for video editing, and for the most part, it did work fine. I did run into a bottleneck when I tried to do more than just edit a video. Now typically I have 8 to 10 tabs open on Safari or Chrome, iMessage, Spotify, YouTube, Photoshop, all opened at once. But I know that my setup is not typical. I am a pro user, and that's why the MacBook Pro is there for someone like me. But for her, she'll have a few tabs open, maybe listen to a podcast, watch a few videos, and run her website. So for those things, the MacBook Air is perfect. She's never ran into any performance issues at all. Now her favorite feature is battery life, giving her nearly 3 days. Now granted, she's not on it 8 to 10 hours a day as I would be, but even then, having days of battery life is unheard of in a laptop. Now, the new MacBook Air with the M2 chip is starting at $1,200, whereas the MacBook Air with the M1 starts at $999. Now, all the specs I'll toss on a chart where you can see the main difference, and I'll also link to Apple's website. Now, size-wise, the M2 is smaller and lighter, but really not by much. Now we're talking fractions of an inch. But what's more impressive is that you have a bigger screen overall on a smaller and lighter laptop. The M1 is 13.3 inches and the M2 is 13.6 inches. The display also gets 100 nits brighter. The M2, you can actually spec it out more than the M1. So if you need a higher end spec and for whatever reason you don't want to go to a MacBook Pro, you can get up to a 10 core GPU and up to a 24 gigabytes of unified memory compared to 8 core GPU and 16 gigabytes of unified memory. The M2 also does allow for ProRes encode and decode engine, which for video editors like me, definitely makes sense, but for people who are buying an Air, I don't think that really matters when it comes to specs. By the way, guys, if you're enjoying this content, make sure you hit subscribe and ring that bell notification to be notified when I make another video. Got a lot of great things planned this summer and of course, this fall. Now the M2 MacBook Air also has a 1080p webcam compared to the M1 MacBook Air's 720p webcam. Now side note, Apple did announce that you'll be able to use your iPhone's camera as a webcam. That will be available in the fall. So even if the 1080p camera isn't that much better, you will still have a better option. So that sums up the differences between the M1 Air and the M2 Air. Now for the price, the M1 MacBook Air is still a fantastic computer and it's extremely capable for a majority of people. Now the M2 is a bit more smaller, a bit lighter, and it's faster, but for day-to-day performance, it's not gonna be much faster than the M1 Air just because the M1 is nearly instantaneous in everything it does. However, if you need to unlock more performance and you may start wanting to take advantage of some of the things that a Mac can do, then the M2 will give you more horsepower to do those things, and it's something you could grow into. Now, when we talk about the M2 MacBook Pro, not this one that just came out, but later down the line, it's going to be interesting to see if the M2 MacBook Pro can do enough to justify getting one over a M2 MacBook Air. Because right now, spec for spec, they're almost on par. So the MacBook Pro does give you an extra fan, which really isn't required because it runs so, efficiently anyways. But the MacBook Pro typically gives you more USB ports and also the ability to run more than one display off of it. And that is really the main difference as of now. So we're gonna see what the M2 can provide for the MacBook line series a little bit later in the fall. Now, if you are coming from a MacBook Pro and you have a M1 Pro or M1 Max or M1 Ultra, those chips are still more powerful than the M2. The M2 definitely will have a Pro, a Max, and Ultra version, but right now, the M2 cannot replace your current higher end M1. Also, I do question when the new iPads come out, are these gonna be iPads with the M2 chip? iPads become more powerful than ever, and I'm wondering, are people making that switch to iPad who would typically get a MacBook Air? I am interested in learning about that because like recently my mom was looking to buy a new laptop and we ended up going with an iPad with a keyboard, and that does everything she wants it to do and more. So it makes me wonder, like, who is the MacBook Air for? Like, is there that same market for the Air, for the Pro, and for the iPad? And then the iPad Air? Like, to me, everything is getting so good and so fast. It's just the lines are becoming blurred on which product to recommend for the right person once you're out of the Pro line. Anyways, that is all I have for you today. I hope I answered your question. This is Kevin the Tech Ninja. Have a wonderful day, and we'll talk later.